There are towns in the American West where a woman becomes the fixed point by which everything else orients itself, not because she demands it, not because she performs it, but because something in her bearing, some particular combination of steadiness and warmth and the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness but fullness, makes every room she enters feel slightly more settled than it was before. In Harmon Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1879, that woman was Laurel Vane. She was 28 years old, the only schoolteacher Harmon Creek had managed to keep for more than a season. She had arrived 3 years earlier from Abilene with a single trunk, 2 crates of books, and the kind of calm that people initially mistook for shyness until they spent 5 minutes in her company and understood it was simply the opposite of performance. She had brown hair she kept pinned back during school hours and loose at the ends of the day, and eyes that were dark and direct and had a habit of seeing things a half second before other people noticed them. She was funny in the dry, unhurried way of someone who has never needed a laugh to land on time. She was patient in the way that only people who have survived impatience can be, and she was, in the particular estimation of the women of Harmon Creek, exactly the kind of person you wanted living in your town, because she made the children better and the men behave and the whole place feel like it had a center. Every eligible man in the county had thought about Laurel Vane. Most of them had done something about it. There had been suppers and Sunday walks and flowers left on the schoolhouse steps in the early mornings when she would arrive to find them wilting slightly in the September heat. A cattleman from Pueblo had ridden 2 days to make a case for himself that she had heard out with complete attention, and then declined with a warmth so genuine it took him the whole ride home to realize she'd said no. Laurel had declined all of them, not coldly, not cruelly, in a way that left the men somehow feeling they had been seen and respected, which was perhaps even harder to be angry about than rejection usually is. The town had theories. She was too particular. She was pining for someone back in Abilene. She had decided on independence, which some said admiringly and some said otherwise, depending on who was talking. None of the theories were correct. The answer was simpler than that, and more inconvenient, and it had been sitting 3 buildings down from the schoolhouse for the entire 3 years she'd been there. His name was Nate Collier. He ran the feed and hardware store on the north end of Harmon Creek's Main Street, had run it since his father passed 6 years ago, and was, by the general consensus of the town, the most reliable man in Harmon Creek and possibly in the surrounding counties. He was 33, lean and sun-weathered, with hands that were always rough, and a way of listening that made people feel their problems were worth hearing. He gave honest weight on the scale and honest prices on the ledger, and had extended credit quietly and without ceremony to 4 families after the drought 2 years back, never once mentioning it unless they brought it up first. He and Laurel had known each other from her first week in town. She had come in for chalk and lamp oil, and he had walked her through the store with the patient attention of a man who took his work seriously, and they had ended up talking for 45 minutes about books, which neither of them had expected. After that, they talked easily, often. She came in every 2 weeks for supplies, and they talked the way people do when talking is the natural condition between them, without effort, without performance, about the town and the weather, and what she was reading and what he'd heard from the supply freighter about conditions east of the mountains. Nate Collier thought about Laurel Vane the way you think about the fire in the hearth when the room is cold. You're aware it's there, you're grateful for it, and somehow, in the way of things you've always had access to, you never quite move toward it because some part of you can't fully believe it was ever really meant for you. He came into the schoolhouse one October afternoon to fix the stovepipe that had been pulling smoke since the first cold snap. She was finishing the day's lessons, and the last 3 students were still packing their slates. He nodded to her. She nodded back. He went to work on the stove. "Morning, Miss Vane," he said, which was wrong by several hours, and she pointed that out. "It's 3:30, Nate." "So it is," He didn't look up from the stovepipe. Long day. They're all long days, she said without complaint, in the way of someone who finds long days preferable to short ones. He fixed the stove. He left. Outside on the street, Frank Odom, who had been turned down by Laurel the previous spring and had reached the philosophical stage of the experience, watched Nate walk past and shook his head with the slow certainty of a man who has seen something obvious go unrecognized for too long. Frank did not say anything. He thought about saying something. He decided against it, because there are moments when timing is everything, and that moment was not yet the right one. But he was thinking about something Nate didn't know. He was thinking about the letter that had arrived at the post office 3 days ago, addressed to Laurel Vane in a hand he didn't recognize, postmarked from Denver. He'd only seen the envelope because he'd been standing at the window when the postmaster sorted the morning's mail. The return address was a law office. The Harmon Creek Harvest Supper was held in the Methodist Hall on the second Saturday of October. Laurel did not particularly want to go. She had papers to grade and a chapter she was halfway through and a genuine preference for quiet evenings. But the school board chair had helped hang the decorations, and her students would be there, and the entirety of Harmon Creek would notice her absence. In the way of small towns that track these things, so she won't. She wore her good dress, the dark green one with the fitted waist, and she came in with the particular composure of a woman who has made peace with being noticed. The room was warm and loud with the specific comfort of people who know each other well enough to argue and make up and argue again. The offers to sit with her, to get her punch, to show her the pie selection, came within the first 10 minutes. She was gracious about all of it. Nate arrived late because someone's wagon had thrown a wheel near the edge of town, and he'd helped them get it sorted before he cleaned up and came. He got himself a cup of coffee from the table and found a quiet place near the wall and watched the room with the ease of a man who is content to be present without being the center of it. He saw Laurel across the hall. She was talking to the Reverend's wife, and she had that way of listening she had, where the whole of her attention went to the person she was with, which made whoever it was feel like the most important person in the room. He noticed it because he'd been on the receiving end of it enough times to know how it felt. She caught his eye over the Reverend's wife's shoulder. She gave him the kind of look she only gave him. Not the general warmth she offered everyone. Something quieter and more specific. A slight arch of the brow that meant something like, "You're late and you have sawdust on your collar, but I'm glad you're here." It was gone in a moment. Nate almost registered it. Almost. Then somebody needed to know whether he had any axle grease left in the storeroom, and he turned his attention there with the uncomplicated ease of a man who had no idea what he'd just failed to notice. Across the room, Laurel watched him turn away. She kept her expression pleasant and returned her attention to the Reverend's wife, who was talking about the quilt drive for the coming winter. And Laurel, who was very good at keeping her expression pleasant, felt something she had been managing not to feel for some time now. The letter in her desk drawer was from a school in Denver. A new school, a good one, with a proper salary and a principal who had written to her on the recommendation of her former teacher in Abilene. They wanted an answer by the 1st of December, 6 weeks. Laurel had not told anyone about the letter. She needed to think. But the thinking kept coming back to the same uncomfortable truth, that she had stayed in Harmon Creek past what made straightforward sense, and the reason she had stayed was standing near the far wall of the Methodist Hall drinking coffee and talking about axle grease. 3 days after the harvest supper, Frank Odom ran into Nate at the feed store and said what he'd decided against saying on the street. He didn't circle it. Laurel Vane got a letter from a school in Denver. Word is it's a serious offer. She'd be gone by spring. Nate was entering numbers in the ledger. He didn't look up immediately. "Where'd you hear that?" Postmaster saw the return address. "My wife's cousin works at the Denver school. Not impossible she might have mentioned it to my wife." Frank shrugged. "These things get around." Nate set down the pen. "When?" "Letter came in about a week ago. She's got until December 1st to answer." The store was quiet. Someone's horse shook its bridle outside. The stove in the corner ticked against the cold. Frank looked at him across the counter. I'm telling you this because you are, and I say this as someone who has known you for 15 years, the most quietly oblivious man I have ever encountered. Nate looked at him. Nate. Frank's voice was patient the way a man's voice gets when he has been patient about something for a long time. She's been here 3 years. You know how many of those offers she's turned down. You know that woman better than anybody in this town, and you have been treating that fact like it's a piece of furniture you walk around every day without thinking about. He put his hat on. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that Denver is a long way from here, and December is not as far off as it sounds. He left. Nate stood in the store for a while after that. The ledger was open in front of him, and he looked at it without seeing it. Outside, the October wind moved through the gaps in the storefront boards. Denver. A school. December. He thought about the day she'd come in for chalk and lamp oil and they'd talked for 3/4 of an hour about novels. He thought about the look she'd given him across the Methodist Hall 3 nights ago, the one he'd almost registered and then turned away from. He thought about 3 years of those looks, actually, now that he was paying attention, and felt something rearrange itself in his chest with the specific discomfort of a man who understands he has been misreading something important for a very long time. He reached under the counter for the small jar where he kept the coins he set aside for things he didn't get around to buying. There was enough. He closed the ledger. It happened on a Thursday, 2 days later. The afternoon was cold and clear the way Colorado afternoons get in October. The sky a hard, bright blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek gone to gold. Laurel was walking home from the schoolhouse with a stack of readers under her arm when she passed the hardware store. Nate was out front, replacing a board on the porch that had gone soft. He heard her footsteps and looked up, and she stopped because she always stopped, because 5 minutes with him was better than 5 minutes without him, and she had stopped lying to herself about that some time ago. They talked about the cold front coming in from the north, and whether the Henderson boy was settling down in class, and the price of lamp oil, which had gone up again. And then Nate set down his hammer and looked at her. Really looked. The way he did sometimes when he forgot to keep it casual. She saw something move across his face that she hadn't seen there before, not the ease of long familiarity. Something underneath it, something that had been there for a while but hadn't had a name until right now. He said, I heard about Denver. She went still. I don't have any right to say anything about it, he said. I know that. I've had no right for a long time because I've been standing here for 3 years and not saying what I should have said. He looked at the hammer in his hand and then set it down on the porch railing. But I'd like to say something before you make any decisions, if that's all right. The street was cold and bright. Somewhere down the block, children were arguing about something. She waited. I think I have been in love with you for about 2.5 years, he said, and I have been doing a very thorough job of not knowing it, which I understand is not a point in my favor. But I'm telling you now because the alternative is watching you leave for Denver in the spring and spending the rest of my life knowing I never said it. He paused. And I'm not willing to do that, even if it's too late, even if you've already decided. He looked at her directly, the way he looked at things he intended to take seriously. I see you, Laurel. I think I always have. I was just slow to understand what I was looking at. Laurel was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods at the end of the street. She thought about 3 years of Thursday afternoons. She thought about the harvest supper and the look she'd given him and watching him turn away. She thought about the letter in her desk drawer and the 6 weeks she'd been thinking about it and what the thinking always came back to. She took 1 step toward him. Nate, she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. I didn't stay in Harmon Creek for the scenery. I have been waiting for you to figure it out, and I am very glad you finally did. She held his gaze long enough for that to land. Then she said, but I need you to understand something. I almost said yes to Denver. Another few weeks, and I would have. I know, he said. Don't make me that close again. I won't, he said, and he meant it the way he meant things, quietly and completely. Before we go on, I want to ask you something. What state or country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments below. It means a great deal to me to know where these stories reach. Now, let's go back to Harmon Creek, because Nate Collier still has some things to take care of. He went to the schoolhouse the next morning. Good shirt, hair combed, carrying a small bundle of late-season wildflowers, he'd stopped to pick along the creek path because he had been listening to himself for once. He arrived before the students did, which meant Laurel answered the door herself. She looked at the flowers. She looked at him. "Nate Collier," she said, "you picked those yourself, along the creek. They're half frozen. I know, I was up early." She took them from him and set them in the water jar on her desk where the students would see them and wonder, and she did not plan to explain them to anyone. He asked if he could come for supper on Friday properly, with her landlady's permission, which he already had because he'd stopped there first on his way to the schoolhouse. Laurel looked at him for a moment with the look that meant she was working out whether to be amused or moved, and settled somewhere in between. "You already asked Margaret?" "First stop, and she said yes," she said, and I'm quoting here. "It's about time," Laurel laughed, the real one, the one that reached her eyes. "Friday," she said. What followed was the most discussed courtship in Harmon Creek's recent memory, which was saying something for a town that had limited entertainment options and a great deal of opinion on other people's business. He came for supper on Friday, and was there past 9 o'clock, which Margaret, the landlady, found entirely appropriate given the circumstances. He came to Sunday services, which he had been doing already, but which now felt different because they sat together, and half the congregation spent a portion of the sermon quietly pleased with themselves for having seen this coming. He brought wildflowers every time he came. Not the same ones, different ones, whatever, was still coming up late in the season along the creek path or at the edge of the fields. When the flowers ran out with the first hard frost, he brought her a book he'd ordered from a catalog in Denver, which he had done before she'd received the letter, which he thought was important to mention, and which she found she believed. "You ordered it in August," she said, looking at the date on the invoice he'd folded inside the front cover. "You mentioned the author in July." She looked at him over the book. "You remembered that. I remember everything you tell me," he said without drama as a simple statement of fact. She was quiet a moment. "Then, you have been terrible at showing that." "I have been," he agreed. "I'm working on it." On a Sunday in November, they rode out to the high meadow above town, where the valley opened up below and the mountains stood white and permanent against the sky. The grass was brown now, the cottonwoods bare, the creek glinting in the cold. They sat on a flat rock and talked about real things. Why me, he asked, because he wanted to understand it. There were men with more to offer. There were men with more to show, she said. That's different. She looked at the valley. Every man who came was presenting me with something. His land, his standing, what he could provide. You never did that. You just talked to me about books and the weather and what was actually happening. You were the same every single time. She paused. That's rarer than you'd think. I always knew exactly what I was getting with you. The problem was you didn't know you were offering it. He was quiet. Denver is a good school, she said. I want you to know I wasn't running from anything. It was a real opportunity. I know, I'm not staying because I have nothing else. I know that too. She looked at him. I'm staying because you were always the choice, Nate. Not the default. Not the easy option, the actual choice. She paused. Don't make me say that again. He looked at this woman who had held something quietly for 3 years and offered it to him without conditions and felt the weight of what almost hadn't happened settle over him completely. The valley was gold and brown below. The mountains were doing what they always did. He took her hand. I won't make you say it again, he said. I'm going to spend a while making it unnecessary. December in Colorado closes down fast. The cold comes early, the days shorten, and the mountains disappear into cloud for days at a time. Laurel wrote to Denver on the 28th of November, thanking them with genuine warmth and declining with the kind of clarity that left no room for a follow-up offer. She did not tell Nate she had sent the letter until after it was done. When she did, he was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to tell me before," he said. "I know," she said. "It was my decision to make." "Yes, but I wanted you to know I made it clearly. Not out of uncertainty. Not because I was afraid of Denver." She looked at him. "Because I wanted to be here." He asked her on a January evening when the creek was frozen and the town was quiet under new snow. He had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket. He'd cleaned it for 2 days and carried it for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest, not staged. She had finished grading papers and come downstairs to find him in the parlor, which was not unusual now. What was unusual was the way he was sitting, with the specific uprightness of a man who has made a decision and is holding it carefully. "Laurel," he said when she sat down across from him, "I want to say something plainly, because I've been unclear for long enough, and you've been patient past what was reasonable, and I don't want to add one more moment to that." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I believe I have for most of the time I've known you, which I understand does not reflect well on my powers of observation, but I know it now with the same certainty I know the things I'm most sure of. And I would like you to be my wife, if you're willing to take on a man who was slow and is trying to make up for it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know," she said, "for a man who listens to everything I say, you waited an extraordinarily long time to say anything back. I know, that's not exactly poetic. No, I don't think poetry is what I do." "No," she agreed. "You do other things." A pause. "Yes, Nate, I'll marry you. You didn't need to make a speech about it. I would have told you that any time in the past 2 years if you'd thought to ask." He put the ring on her finger in the parlor with the snow coming down outside, and she looked at it with the look of someone who recognizes something. Not new. Finally, exactly where it was supposed to be. They were married in February, in the Methodist church, on a day when the sun came out for the first time in 2 weeks, as though it had been waiting for a specific occasion. The pews were full. Harmon Creek had most of it, a strong sense of personal investment in how this turned out, and they had earned their seats. Frank Odom, in the 4th pew, was observed to be sitting slightly straighter than usual, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who said the right thing at the right moment and is too dignified to mention it. Laurel came down the aisle in her mother's dress, which had been let out at the sleeves and taken in at the waist, carrying a small bunch of dried wildflowers because there were no fresh ones in February, but she'd saved the ones from the creek that autumn and pressed them, and they meant more than hothouse roses would have. She walked without hurry. She arrived. Nate stood at the front and watched her come and felt, with the particular clarity that comes from understanding what almost didn't happen, exactly what he was looking at. He was not going to be slow about it again. The years that followed were good ones, practical and warm, and built from the particular comfort of 2 people who have known each other long enough to stop pretending and have chosen each other anyway. The hardware store grew. Laurel continued teaching because she wanted to, and because Harmon Creek couldn't have managed without her, and because Nate never once suggested she should do otherwise. She kept the accounts for the store, too, and discovered in the first month that Nate had been extending credit to families without recording it, which she added to the ledger and told him quietly that she was glad he'd done it, and also that he needed to write things down. He didn't argue. Their daughter arrived in the 2nd year. They named her June, for the month Nate had finally come to his senses, which he claimed was not the reason and which no one believed. June had her father's patience and her mother's way of seeing things early, which made her a child of devastating perceptiveness and occasional conversational inconvenience. Their son came in the 4th year. They named him Clem for no particular reason except that it suited him from the first day, which these things sometimes do. On a winter evening in their 7th year, Nate came home from the store to find Laurel grading papers at the kitchen table, as she did most evenings, with the lamp turned up and her hair loose and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow because she'd forgotten it, as she always did. He stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself. She felt him there, the way she always felt him, and looked up. "You're staring," she said. "I know. You've been doing that more lately." "Have I?" "Since about the time you started understanding what you were looking at, I think." He came in and pulled out the chair next to her and sat down and took the cold cup of tea and set it aside and held her hand instead. "I see you," he said, not as an announcement. She looked at him for a moment. "You always did," she said. "You just needed someone to point it out." "Frank Odom." "Frank Odom," she agreed. Outside, June and Clem were being loud about something in the other room with the complete conviction of children who have not yet learned to moderate their volume. The lamp burned steadily. The winter wind came under the door, and Nate Collier sat in his own kitchen, holding his wife's hand, and thought about the letter from Denver and the harvest supper and the way she'd looked at him across the Methodist hall and he'd turned away to talk about axle grease. The specific gratitude of a man who knows exactly what he almost lost and didn't is not a small thing. It settles differently than ordinary happiness. Heavier, more careful, he did not waste another day of it. Years later, when June was old enough to be curious about things that had happened before she was old enough to remember them, she asked her mother how she had known. They were hanging laundry in the cold February air, which in Harmon Creek was simply something you did, and the question came in the middle of pinning a sheet. The way the real questions always come, sideways and without warning. "How did you know Papa was right?" "Before he knew." Laurel took her time with the sheet. "He never showed off," she said finally. "Every man who ever came around was showing me something. What he owned, what he could do, how I'd be better off with him. Your father just talked to me. The same every time, whether he'd had a good week or a bad one, whether the store was doing well or the credit book was full." She smoothed the corner of the sheet against the line. "I always knew exactly who he was. He just didn't know what that meant to me." June considered this, but you almost left. "For Denver, yes. Weren't you scared he'd never say anything?" Laurel was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard. "Every day," she said honestly. "That's the part I want you to remember, Junie. Not how it ended. The almost." She looked at her daughter. "Know what you want. Don't perform for anyone, not to seem more available, not to seem less interested, not to make someone comfortable at the cost of your own honesty. Know what you want and live like yourself, and at some point, if the person is worth waiting for, you say the true thing." She handed June another pin. "And then you find out. What if it doesn't work?" Laurel picked up the next shirt from the basket. "Then you know. And you move forward, and you find that you're all right, and you make a different life, and it's a good one." She paused. "But June, in my experience, when you say the true thing to the right person, they hear it, even the slow ones." A pause and something like amusement crossing her face, especially the slow ones. Laurel Vane did not wait passively. She taught school and read every book she could find, and managed her own life with the competent independence of a woman who had never expected anyone to hand her anything. She said yes to the Denver offer. She wrote the letter declining it of her own free will, for her own reasons after she had what she needed. And when the moment came, on a cold October street with the cottonwoods gold and the sky hard blue, she said the true thing first. She was the one who stepped forward. She was the one who said, "I didn't stay in Harmon Creek for the scenery." That took more courage than anything Nate did. Nate is not a villain. He is something more recognizable than that. A man who had convinced himself that something wonderful existed slightly beyond his reach, until the morning Frank Odom told him about Denver. Until the moment the quiet clock that had been running in the background of his life became suddenly, undeniably loud. Sometimes that's what it takes, not the arrival of love. The love was already there. What it takes is the understanding that love, like any real and valuable thing, does not wait without limit. They found each other at the last reasonable moment. deliberately, clearly, with full knowledge of how close they had cut it, and they held on. That's the part worth keeping.